Glad to invite Ray Boshara up to the podium to deliver the keynote address over lunch. Ray, as you've heard earlier, has been working in the space for a long time and has, in his most current role, works at the Federal Reserve of St. Louis, where he's the Senior Advisor and Director of the Center for Household Financial Stability. His bio is included along with all of the panelists' bios in your packet of information. And so I was instructed on a short introduction, and also want to point out things that having the opportunity to read people's bios, I get to learn about them and new and different things that I didn't know previously. So he is currently the director of the Center for Household Financial Stability. He's where they're doing good work on household financial balance sheets with the big data, and working hard to make the connection to the consumer experience on the ground and how policy can support that experience. He's also worked at CFED and at New America, other large consumer advocacy and think tank groups in the space, and was working with the UN in Rome, which is an interesting piece of Ray's experience, and advised the Bush, Clinton, and Obama administrations on financial balance sheet related policies, and is a graduate of OSU, Ohio State, for those in the room who are connected there, as well as Yale Divinity School and the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. So with that, I'm glad to welcome Ray, who is going to talk with us about some of the big picture ideas that we're discussing today.
Good afternoon, everybody. How are you? So I was in Rome because I was following my wife. I got a lot of credit as a feminist for going to Rome and living off her for a few years. Don't think I deserved it. But basically, that's why I'm in St. Louis, too. I married somebody worth following, and she's taken me all over the world, and last stop is St. Louis. So stay tuned. We'll see what's next. Thank you, Terry and Matt, very much for the invitation. I really appreciate it. And it's nice to, I really like the fact that you wanted me to step back and reflect, think about the bigger picture, not really talk about financial inclusion per se, but sort of what, what it's part of, this bigger field of building assets. So, in our lives, I think we often pause to reflect on what matters. And of course, some things always matter, and others depend on a time and place. And so what I'd like to do is talk about what now actually matters for our field, the assets field, going forward. So we've spent the better part of 25 years now successfully arguing and generating evidence that assets matter. Assets matter in ways that income and wages and education do not. We've shown that assets matter for, this is with hard evidence, financial security, upward economic mobility, child and maternal development, college access and completion, just to name a few. So I think the field has it's really on the map now. We've done that. But of course, our path towards assets inclusion, or assets for all, kind of our dream, has zigged and zagged. Just as America's journey towards, just as America's journey has zigged and zagged as well, though President Obama reminded us shortly after the election that our path, America's path towards inclusion, is actually moving in that direction. The trend is towards inclusion. And of course, the long arc of our moral universe, as Martin Luther King Jr. assures us, also bends towards justice. So after debuting in the early 1990s with an extended honeymoon of lavish attention from policymakers, from funders, from media, our party, our dream of assets inclusion, came to a really abrupt end with the financial crisis and the Great Recession. Not only did that recession deplete the wealth of the very people whose wealth we aim to build, it also challenged the very credibility of our idea. It was like an earnest, truth-seeking Christian reading Nietzsche for the first time. You lose your faith, and you're never really the same. I actually had that experience. So I think our field, we've changed. We have a lot of new friends. For example, displacing the legacy foundations of our field, we now have the well-recovered wealth of financial institutions donating to our field to help recover the wealth of struggling families. Big insurance companies now commendably support our work, even when our clients have little assets to insure. We discovered that the balance sheet actually has two sides, the savings and the debt side. And we've made a lot of new friends who've been battling destructive debts for a long time. We really were very focused, very siloed, thinking about assets and only assets and not much else. And we've made peace with our longstanding income support colleagues and conceding that income does in fact matter for building wealth. We also ignored the income side for a long time too, as many of you know in the field. So I think in our recovery, in our new selves, we've discovered that it's not just the assets that matter, but what makes assets possible, real, and enduring. And if we get that right, assets can lead to building wealth. So what else matters right now for building wealth? Well, of course, many things matter. Technology, which we talked about, income volatility, public policy, health insurance, legal services. There's a whole range of things that, of course, matter for building wealth. But what I'm going to do is briefly talk about 5 ideas, 5 things that arise from our research center at the St. Louis Fed and other work that the Fed has been pursuing. So these are college, insurance, demography, early investments, and place. Let me just talk briefly about each one of those. So first is college matters, however, and the however is very important here. So the Great Recession eviscerated $16 trillion in family wealth, right? And it made painfully clear that having an asset, a home in this case, ended up being a wealth-losing proposition for low-income families. Minority families and other struggling families. You were actually better off not having a home during that time if building wealth was your goal or your expectation. Well, last year, the St. Louis Fed, our center, published research showing that a college degree also predicted losing wealth for minority families over the past generation. While having a degree generally predicts having more wealth, there's a strong correlation there. If you look at the change in wealth since 1992, what's happened over the last generation, we found that college-educated whites and Asians have seen their wealth soar by 86%, while college-educated blacks and Hispanics have seen their wealth plummet by over 55%. All right? Like, how could this happen, right? College degree, the big asset we all say is the most important, actually meant losing wealth for minority families over a 25-year period. We were so troubled by this finding that we organized a research symposium to see what was underlying it. Lindsay and Eric were contributors to that conference, as were some other folks in the room. And just last week, we published the papers to say, well, what's going on here? We tried to peel back the onion. And we found that differences could be explained by, 1, differences in the college preparation and finance, a lot more student loans, pre-academic training. By secondly, in home delinquencies and foreclosures, which had a huge and disproportionate negative effect on minority families. Third, families shared wealth very differently, right? Whites were much more likely to receive more assistance from parents, whereas blacks and minorities not only received less, they actually were likely to give wealth to extended family in need, or a niece or a nephew who wanted to go to college or start a business. right? And then finally, we found out that discrimination actually played a continuing role for African Americans in particular. But debts were a huge factor, both college debts and homeownership debts. And debts are something that I think our field needs to do a lot more work with. We're doing a whole series around tipping points in household debt. We're working with the folks at Aspen on their EPIC project, which I think will have a focus on debt. But our research symposium really revealed, I think, three lessons. One is how an asset is financed matters as much as the asset itself, right? So we must finance college and home ownership with less debts and more savings. Two, while college is essential, especially in today's economy, college alone is not likely to lead to building wealth, especially for minority families. And three, we need measures to build economic resilience. Savings, access to credit, and insurance. The real question is, how do you keep struggling families in college and in homes so they can actually get a degree and have the ability to pay off those debts and not be burdened by pressures from families and many others? So you have to make sure that a financial emergency doesn't spiral down into the loss of an asset. So just to reference Suzanne very briefly, if we can't stop the rain, can we build a better umbrella, right? So that's the first thing that matters is college, however, and we need to think very differently about how we finance college especially and how we finance homes as well. Second thing that matters is insurance. This is, I think, a newer thing in the field, at least for me. I think, as I mentioned, we're very fortunate now to have companies like Prudential and MetLife really providing significant funding for our family. And I hope that their engagement helps us figure out how we can think about not just pulling the risk of income loss, that's kind of the basic idea of the safety net and the social insurance program, but how do you pull the risk of losing an asset as well, right? How do you pull the risk of asset loss? And that's tricky, but I think it's important because, as I've just shown, assets have been a very risky proposition over the last couple of decades for the struggling families that we all really care about. But also because in this economy, it's harder for families to accumulate assets just as they need assets even more, right? So the need for the risk around and the challenge of accumulating assets have all gone up. This risk aversion, along with inadequate and highly unpredictable incomes, explains to me at least why Pew and the U.S. Financial Diaries have found that an overwhelming majority of families now prefer economic security over upward economic mobility, right? That's a kind of a big shift. It was always like the American dream, move up the ladder, and overwhelmingly families want security now. But there's no way to build wealth without taking a risk. So here's the challenge. You can't build wealth without taking some risk. So the real question is, should that risk be completely individualized? Should the individual have to bear all that risk? We don't do that on the income side, okay? I mean, we do it on the income side, but we don't do it on the asset side. So I think the answer is no. So, we have institutions like the Fed. We had a bailout package called TARP, the whole purpose was to bail out folks who took risks. A lot of money was spent on those things. But some of you may know that there was actually a $50 billion provision in TARP to bail out underwater homeowners. But removing that provision was the first success in the establishment of the Tea Party in the United States. There was such an aversion to the idea that we would bail out failed homeowners, that the provision was removed, and not having that bailout provision has cost those families and cost this country in terms of economic growth. So nonetheless, we have to think about ways for individuals not to fully bear the risk of owning an asset. So how do we do that? Let me just mention 3 ways very quickly. I think as the Financial Diaries and other research shows, we have to pursue products that combine 3 things. One product, and John reminded me that we have to do one product because it's too costly to do separate products, a product that brings together savings, credit, and insurance. That's the holy grail. We have to figure that out. And the previous panel had some great product ideas that I think are making progress on that goal. Secondly, we have to keep innovating on the wage insurance side, like Robert Schiller has done. But also, as I mentioned, start thinking about the way of pulling the risk of losing an asset. So it's not just put on the individual. And to me, this is one of the biggest and most exciting challenges going forward, and one that I'm gratefully going to be able to pursue in partnership with the Aspen Institute later this year, is trying to figure out what that actually means. And finally, I mentioned a lot of the new friends we've made in the field. One of them needs to be, I think, folks working on community wealth building, broad-based ownership models such as ESOPs and co-ops, and maybe more around CDFIs. These are great risk-sharing models that I think our field needs to do more work around. Okay, 3, demography matters. So I'm not going to say a lot about this because I've published a lot on this topic. My center has. Over the last couple of years, I have a chapter in a book called What It's Worth, where I talk about the demographics of wealth. You can get it for free online. But let me just say briefly, that in our center, we've tried to get away from using income as determining who has wealth and who doesn't. It's not a very stable measure. But we've instead looked at these demographic drivers of age, race and ethnicity, and education. And they turn out to be fairly strong and reliable predictors of who's going to build wealth and who's not. So I already mentioned how having a college degree for whites led to more wealth for whites and Asians, but less wealth for Hispanics and blacks. Overall, what we found is that younger, less educated, and minority families have generally lost wealth since the recession and have yet to recover it, while older, better educated, and white and Asian Americans also lost wealth in the recession, but they have more than recovered it. It's as if thrivers, as we call them, have tailwinds behind them in their efforts to build savings and wealth, but strugglers, as we call them, face headwinds. So a similar effort does not lead to similar levels of wealth. So what do we do with this? What's the takeaway? I think that as we target scarce public and private resources, we have to think more strongly about these demographic factors. How do we target our resources? We have to think much more about race, about education, and about age than we have in the past. Surprisingly, age turned out to be the strongest predictor of who's building wealth and who's not. Many of you have seen that millennials are struggling. If you look at the wealth numbers, somebody born in 1970 is on track to have 40% less wealth over their lifetime than somebody born in 1940. All right, they're doing better in terms of education and maybe even in terms of income, but on wealth, it could be the first generation not to do better than their parents or grandparents. All right, this is huge, okay, and it's exacerbated further, as you can imagine, if you're also a minority. So now to the young folks in the room here, you're all doing great. You've got your degrees. You're probably going to graduate school. You're probably going to be fine, but know that for most Americans, we have a generational challenge here that I think we all need to think about. All right, so number 4, early investments matter. Some of you may have seen the new economic mobility book that the Fed just published. It's the result of a large research conference that the Board of Governors and the St. Louis Fed organized 2 years ago. Dave Buchholz at the board and I wrote the opening chapter, and we attempted to summarize what we learned and where the idea of economic mobility is headed. And there's 3 sections which follows the organization of the conference. We summarized the first section of the book very succinctly. Starting point matters. And I would say that it matters more now than it did a generation ago, and it matters more than we thought. So here's, what do we mean by starting point? We mean your race or ethnicity, your parents' income, wealth, educational, and marital status, the generation into which you were born. It actually matters if you were silent or Gen X or a boomer, and also the economic moment in history. Was there a strong safety net, and generous government policies? These things actually had a huge impact on whether or not you built wealth over a lifetime. The luck of when you happened to be born. So here's the punchline about early investments. Whatever inequality you care about, that we care about, income, wealth, health, education, it appears that the seeds of those inequalities are planted very early in life, persist through life, and get magnified through life, right? For example, Roland Fryer of Harvard found that black-white test score gaps were non-existent between ages 0 and 1, but that black children fall quickly behind after that, such that by age 2, substantial gaps already exist, largely due to the cumulative effect of different early age environments. Remarkable, really. And so, as many of you know, Raj Chetty and his colleagues have shown higher rates of upward economic mobility among low-income children of any race who are exposed to better neighborhoods earlier in life. James Heckman, of course, has long demonstrated the greater return on early human capital investments, including prenatal investments. And in our field, Michael Sheridan and many folks in this room have reported meaningful benefits to mothers and children, even when very modest amounts of assets are in the home. So the good news here, I think, is that we now know this. We know that early investments actually make a difference, and that early in life interventions can move the needle. So for our field, I think that we have to continue to pursue CSAs, child savings accounts, and baby bonds. And of course, Willie and all of his team deserve enormous credit for moving that forward here. But the real impact, I think, will occur when we combine early asset investments with other early investments in education, health, nutrition, music, and the like. I think that's the thing. You know, we can't just keep pursuing these standalone interventions and think that they and they alone will have impact. It's really bringing these different things together. Okay, finally, number 5 is place matters. Something I probably don't have to convince this room too much of, but let me just make a couple of comments. The second section in our economic mobility book and conference centered on the importance of place. And as was starting point, place matters more than we thought and matters more than it did a generation ago. Another punchline. And so, as Robert Sampson put it, we have to think about what he calls contextual mobility, not just individual mobility. Your context has an enormous impact on whether or not you move up or not. And again, Raj Chetty has taught us all that economic mobility rates not only vary enormously by metropolitan area, but it vary enormously within metropolitan areas. You know, rates between downtown Washington, D.C. and its suburbs are huge. You know, they're enormous. And then Raj Chetty did another study more recently looking at life expectancy, and remarkably, where you live actually matters a great deal. There, if you take an identical poor person and you put them in one community versus another, that poor person could actually live 5 years longer, you know, in a healthier community than they would in a poor community. The person is the same otherwise, but they're going to live 5 years longer if they are in one neighborhood versus another. And Chetty reminds us that the Centers for Disease Control estimates that if we were to eliminate all deaths due to cancer, we would only add 3 years to life expectancy. So 5 years is a huge variation in life expectancy. And then there's a paper in our book by Brown and Mazuski, which found that regional variations in credit scores, access to credit, and types of debt map very well with Chetty's observed economic mobility outcomes, suggesting that regional variations in financial services could also affect economic mobility. So again, there's good news here. We know this, and we know that what happens locally actually matters, perhaps more than national efforts in trying to move the needle forward, whether it's in health or economic mobility. So I believe that all of you, by looking at how place affects financial services, are really onto something important and really something big, something poised to have a real impact. Of course, place matters for economic mobility and life expectancy and financial services, but I don't think we're far from actually seeing how place impacts building wealth. I think you guys are all commendably laying the foundation for this, and I think when we do that, this will be another big step forward for the field, another line of inquiry. So to conclude, I think our great idea of building assets is still a great one, but it's likely to succeed if we don't pursue it in isolation. Other things matter. Asset building alone is not likely to lead to wealth, but pursuing it with debts and insurance, demography, early investments, and place in mind is much more likely to lead to wealth. Thank you.
Yes, I want to invite the audience. I think we have perhaps 6 or 7 minutes for a few questions of Ray.
So I'd like to bring your life expectancy issue home to home in Kansas City. If you look at that picture up there, on the right-hand side of that picture, there are half a dozen zip codes where the differential life expectancy is 13 years. 40% of the people that work for the Kansas City, Missouri city government live in those zip codes. On the left-hand side, the life expectancy differential over in Kansas is 20 years. What I would really like to hear from the academic thinking in your area is somebody starts adding up the incremental cost of tens or hundreds of thousands of people living 10, 15, 20 years less in terms of earnings, in terms of contribution. There's blight on the right, there's blight on the left, and right down the middle, we're building a golden skyway between the two richest parts of our community. Downtown, the population of people in the last 10 years has gone from 5,000 to 20,000, and they're talking about 40,000. The people who were living in downtown in 2005 are being forced out by the rising rents. So the asset accumulation picture, I think, is either out of date or upside down.
Thank you. There's a study in St. Louis called For the Sake of All, forthesakeofall.org, where they've actually quantified the cost of segregation. And life expectancy is one of the things that they quantify and determine what effects that has on earnings and economic growth. So For the Sake of All is a great effort to begin to quantify some of these differences.
Okay, is there 1 or 2 other questions? Andrea?
Thanks. Can you talk a little bit about if you found any differences within the Asian category? Because I feel like there's increasingly evidence that there's a lot of variation.
Absolutely, it's a fair point. It's something we've been in many conversations with other organizations who are working on wealth within Asian communities. Look, the Fed data, unfortunately, is not nuanced enough, not disaggregated enough. There aren't enough in the sample for us to make distinctions among different Asian groups. However, the other research that's out there shows that there are enormous variations in Asian wealth. So, you know, I'm sorry if my brief remarks suggested that all Asians are doing well. They're not. But, you know, I think I should have made the disclaimer, too, that, you know, not all blacks are doing poorly, not all whites are doing well. These are overall numbers, you know, looking at median wealth numbers over the last 25 years. But a lot of the subtlety and the disaggregation is lost. And so you're correct, and I'm glad that you pointed that out. Mm-hmm.
Good afternoon. Van Randolph with the FDIC. You indicated earlier that discrimination played a role in the wealth reduction of minorities that are college educated. Can you elaborate on the types of discrimination?
So my colleagues Bill Emmons and Lowell Ricketts presented a paper at this conference where so it was actually a kind of a radical paper, especially one coming out of the Federal Reserve. The standard economic model assumes that we have equal choice, you know, that everybody has equal opportunity and faces equal choices. That's highly debatable, right? We've heard discussions earlier about the role of institutions and having an impact on the choices that people face. So what my colleagues did is say, well, let's set aside this choice model and assume instead that people have common or shared experiences that shape their individual choices. And when they employed that model, they found that over 80% of the wealth gap could be explained by the shared experience of continuing and historical discrimination. So it's a pretty radical paper, especially coming out of the Fed, but it's pretty significant. And so what we're trying to do is reframe a lot of these discussions about wealth. You can't just assume, as standard economic models do, that everybody faces the same choices. It's not true, and I think, so anyway, we cannot, look, we are far from a post-racial America. Wealth gaps are too enduring and too stark to think that we can believe that we are now in a post-racial America. We're not there, all right? And I think we have to think differently about how we structure these conversations and structure this research to more systematically account for the continuing role that discrimination continues to play.
Are there any other questions? One more chance, one more question for Ray while we have him up here on stage.
I'm around.
Ray will be around. Well, Ray, thank you so much. Every time I hear Ray, I develop a new insight. I think that the most important thing that Ray does is help, because of his deep experience in the broad field of financial security, asset development, poverty alleviation here in the U.S. for the last three decades nearly. You do such a nice job of giving us the much larger policy and economic context for us to understand the work that we're all doing. So thank you very much for your talk this
Thank you for the
afternoon.
opportunity. I really appreciate it.